Hi, and welcome to the video tutorial on the subgraph Uncrashable powered by Float. Subgraph Uncrashable is an extension to the graph CLI or a standalone NPM package, which allows you to create a subgraph that is completely safe, atomic, and consistent, so that you can ensure as continuous uptime as possible on your subgraphs. And in this video, I will walk you through a small demo on how to set up an Uncrashable subgraph from installation to configuration. And as you can see here, we have got a nice set of documentation for the subgraph Uncrashable, which you can then use as a guide as well in accompaniment with this tutorial. So as you can see here, we've got an installation guide. As I said earlier, this package is included as part of the Graph CLI or as a standalone NPM package. And for this tutorial, we'll be walking through the Uncrashable code gen as a part of the Graph CLI. So we'll be using these commands, but be aware that you can also download it as a standalone NPM package if you would like. And of course, in the documentation, once you've installed the package, you can then configure it. And there's a lot of helpful information in the documentation, but we'll walk you through that, all of this in this tutorial. So let's take a look at our example subgraph. So this is the Gravatar subgraph from thegraph.com. And as you can see here, we've got the latest Graph CLI already as of recording of this video. And this includes the Uncrashable code chain as well. As you can see here, run the help command. And we can see that we need this flag -u to run our Uncrashable code gen and generate our helpful file. So let's take a look at this example subgraph and what we have here. So as you can see here, we've got one entity. It's a Gravatar entity. It's got an ID, an owner field, a display name field, and an image URL. And we'll use the graph Uncrashable to generate this entity in an atomic way, but also have consistency of the data in terms of the user ID and of the fields that we expect whenever we create this entity. And I'll walk you through that in a second. So if we just look at the mapping file here, this is unchanged. This is as per the example. And you can see here we're creating a new Gravatar entity, and we're setting all the fields, and then we're saving the entity. So let's start off by walking through this example without doing any Uncrashable code gen. So let's just run the yarn code gen to generate the graph helper file into this file folder. And let's run this yarn code gen. This is the graph code gen command, and this creates the initial graph CLI entity helper files for creating and updating the entities. So there we go, as per your event. So there we go. We've created these generated files, and now we can just run a little test here. Created a little matchstick test that just checks that we are creating the entities correctly. So I've created a new Gravatar event with all these fields, and we're just checking that they are saved correctly in the graph. And we've also updated this. So while this runs, let's start by looking at how we can configure the graph Uncrashable. So as you can see in the documentation here, we need to create an Uncrashable config.yaml file. And this file specifies how we're going to set up our Uncrashable config and how we want to manage our entities. So if we look at this file, we've got a network config field, which has various items, and I'll walk you through that now. And then an entity settings field, and this is per entity that you want to configure. And there are a lot of interesting things we can do here, which we'll walk through. And so as you can see, the documentation outlines everything you need for the graph Uncrashable, but we'll walk through it step by step in this demonstration. So there we go, our testing worked correctly. So now let's go to edit our mapping file to use the Uncrashable config. But first, we need to generate our Uncrashable config and our Uncrashable helper file. So let's take a look. So as per the example in the documentation, we need to set up this Uncrashable config.yaml file. So we start with what we saw there, which was the network config. And this network config specifies how you want to generate your IDs for each specific chain that you may deploy a subgraph to. So this is really useful if you're deploying the same subgraph to two different chains, and you want to amalgamate that data in some way. So say you have an application that runs on two different chains. You might have the same user on both chains. How do you differentiate between which one is on which chain? Well, this allows you to prefix their ID with a specific chain identifier. So then you can then filter your subgraphs based on the network ID for each user. So that's really useful. So, but for this demonstration, we just have a very simple subgraph. We're just going to set the entity ID prefix like so, and we're going to set it to nothing.
Perfect. Perfect.
And there we go. So we'll set it for mainnet, and we'll set the prefix. Oopsie. We'll set the prefix to nothing. So, cool. So there we go. We've set our entity ID prefix for our network. Now we want to set the entity settings. So as I said earlier, this is per entity in your schema, and you can configure this as so. So firstly, we have one entity, which is the Gravatar entity. And we want to firstly set up the entity ID for this entity. And this allows you to specify the exact way you want to set up your IDs for this entity. So every entity that is created of the Gravatar will conform to what your specifications here, which is really useful and allows your graph to be really reliable and consistent. And so we are going to set an entity ID, and we're going to set it. We can set as many parameters as we want, but let's set up just one, and we'll set the name of the parameter to gravity ID, and we'll set the type to big int, because that is what we're getting from our int. Right, so there we go. We've set up our entity ID, and now we just want to set up one more field, which is the use default field. So use default specifies which fields in the entity can basically be null or nothing when the entity is created. And this is really useful when you want to create an entity and guarantee that there's data in that entity when it is created. So in simple examples, perhaps you have a user entity, and for every user, you want to ensure that there's an ETH address in that user entity. Then you'll make sure that it is not specified in the use default field here. So for this example, we're not going to default any of the entities. We're just going to say that all of them are required when we create an entity. Cool. So now this is a very basic Uncrashable configs file. And from here, we can run the Uncrashable codegen. So we can go yarn codegen. And as you remember, the flag is -u. Now we run the codegen, and we see after we've generated the original files. So we've got an issue here. It's actually entity settings. So that was picked up. So that's great. And now we can run the codegen again, the Uncrashable codegen again. Just remember that if you ever add entities or update your schema or whatever, you need to run this again. There we go. So we've updated our original Uncrashable entities file. And as you can see, there are a load of helper functions here, which we'll walk through. Here's our generate ID function, specifying our big int gravity ID that then gets formatted for us with the ID prefix. And we have a lot of other functions here. And for this example, for the first part of this tutorial, we're going to use this create gravatar function. So let's take a look at our mappings again. So as I said earlier, in this handle new gravatar handler, we are creating a new gravatar entity, and then we're just updating all the fields. Now let's see how we can do this with the Uncrashable config. So let's use our create gravatar function, and this takes in our ID. So let's generate our ID, which is generate gravatar ID. And we remember it took in a big int, which is what this is. And as we saw, it formatted the string for us, so we don't have to do any of that. Now we can just import this. To gravatar ID. Okay, we'll get there. And also what we want to do is we just want to set all the non-defaulted fields, which in this case is all of them. So let's do that quickly. So we can just do that. Awesome. And there we go. Awesome. And we have now set up our thing. And now we just need to import these, which we can do from our Uncrashable entities file, which is over here. So we can just go import. Okay, gravatar. New gravatar from, and we want it to come from this file here. It's in the generated folder, and we want Uncrashable entities helpers. There we go. And it's actually not, it's this, apologies. And there we go, we have now compiled. So now we have very simply created a new gravatar entity and created with a generated ID that conforms to our specifications. This is an atomic creation where we don't have to do any manual savings. And we know that any gravatar entity that we've created must have these fields. So it's going to conform and be predictable for us. So now let's run the test again and see if that passes. And now while that runs, we can go on to further configure our Uncrashable config. So now we get to the concept of the setter function. So the setter function allows us to create as many unique functions as we would like, which then updates various fields within our entity based on the entity ID. So as you can see here, we can specify whichever fields that are part of this gravatar entity as we'd like in these functions. And then we can call that with these fields that we want to update. So let's go and do this configuration while we wait for the testing to pass. Great. So now that we've configured all of those, we can now configure our setters. And as you can see, the tests have successfully passed. Cool. So now we've got our setters and we want to create an update gravatar setter. So let's create that. Update gravatar setter. And we want to specify which fields will be updated in this function. Like so. Okay, so we want to update the owner. So we want to update all the fields. The image URL and the display name. Perfect. Now we can run our Uncrashable config again. And we can see that this update gravatar function is created in our helper file. There we go, the codegen is running and our Uncrashable helper file is generated. And if we search for this function here, we see that we've now got an update gravatar function. Awesome. So let's go to our next handler here, the handle update gravatar, and let's see what's happening here. So first thing, what we are doing here is we are loading an entity of the specific ID, and if it doesn't exist, we are then creating that entity and updating the fields, and then doing a manual save. So what we'd like to do instead is we'd like to use our uncrashable helpers to allow us to do this. So firstly, we saw this is the way to generate an ID, and it does all the string formatting for us. So there we go. So we've conformed our ID here. As long as the contracts are emitting the correct events, we know that our IDs will always conform to our standard that we set up in our Uncrashable config. Great, so now we've generated an ID. Now we want to either load or create an entity, whether if it exists, if it doesn't exist. And luckily, the graph Uncrashable config caters for this situation too. And it caters for it in this get or initialize entity function. So let's make use of this function and replace the code here. So let's create a gravatar entity. And we're going to either get or initialize this entity based on the ID that we defined above. And if we are initializing this entity, we want to then specify what are the required fields for a created entity. So as you can see, we have done that above. And let's import this. So there we go. We've already now either retrieved or created a gravatar entity based on this ID. And we can go one step further. So now we don't want to then run the update gravatar function if we've just initialized this gravatar entity. So what we can do is we can check on this gravatar entity that was created. And this tells us if this entity was obviously created. So what we want to do is actually, when this is not true, we want to then run our update gravatar function with our ID. And once again, we specify what fields we want to update, which is these fields here. Great. And there we go. And as you can see here, no manual saving required. We're always conforming to exactly what we're expecting. Every entity that we create always has to conform to having this information. Our IDs are always what we expect, always predictable. And now if we run the test one more time, you will see that they pass, and the code is a lot cleaner and a lot more consistent, atomic, and predictable. Now here we are running the test. And there we have a very quick and easy introduction into the subgraph Uncrashable powered by Float. That is a part of the graph CLI as an extension using the -u flag. So thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you'll make use of this project. And if you do, join us on our Discord and let us know how it's going. Also, if you come up with any issues, please log them on our GitHub page. Yeah, and thank you very much for watching.